On 29 December 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt sat alone in the Oval Office, staring at a letter that carried the weight of Britain's survival. Outside, winter pressed against the White House, and across the Atlantic, cities burned under relentless bombing, while the president felt the heavy hand of history pressing down, quietly but insistently. Winston Churchill's letter lay open before him. Ink urgent, defiant, asking not for sympathy, but for the tools to fight. America was not yet at war. Congress was divided, cautious, hesitant, and Roosevelt knew that every word he considered carried immense political risk. He imagined London under blackout, docks shattered, children sleeping in underground shelters, while Britain, alone, stood its ground. If Britain fell, the oceans would shrink, dictators would rule unchecked, and America's own future would darken. Roosevelt leaned back slowly, eyes closing for a moment, as if he could hear Churchill's voice speaking through the lines, resolute and desperate. In that quiet room, a decision began to form, not yet spoken, not yet written into law, but already shaping the course of the war. Later that night, he marked the margins of the letter, aware that the clock was already ticking. This was more than paper and ink. It trembled with urgency. It was a plea from an island empire, and a test of American resolve. Roosevelt understood the cost of acting, but also the cost of waiting. History, he knew, was watching silently. As dawn approached, he rose from his chair, folded the letter carefully, and prepared to speak to a nation. On 30 December 1940, Roosevelt addressed the American people. His voice calm, deliberate, and measured. Millions listened, anxious, unsure, divided, as he spoke from Washington. He did not name Churchill, yet Britain stood behind every sentence. Battered but unbroken, fighting in the dark. Roosevelt spoke of fires and hoses, of neighbors and communities. Metaphors carefully chosen to soften the unthinkable reality of war. He knew Americans feared another European entanglement, haunted by the ghosts of trenches, crosses, and broken promises. Yet he also knew isolation was an illusion. Oceans were no longer wide enough, threats no longer distant. Across the Atlantic, Churchill read the transcript by lamplight, sensing a shift subtle, yet profound. Roosevelt was preparing the nation's conscience, not with orders, but with logic, with shared responsibility. He described factories, ships, and machines, tools of survival, not instruments of conquest. Behind the speech lay statistics, calculations, and the silent plea of Britain's people, hoping someone, somewhere, would act. This was not a declaration of war, it was a moral alignment, a step toward inevitability. In London that night, air raid sirens wailed again. Yet hope flickered faintly, carried across the waves by radio. Roosevelt ended his address knowing opposition remained strong. Yet momentum had shifted, quietly and irrevocably. The tools were no longer abstract. They were becoming policy, production, and purpose. On 6 January 1941, Roosevelt stood before Congress, the chamber heavy with expectation and doubt. He carried no letter this time. Yet Churchill's words lingered, shaping every phrase already etched in history. America listened as he spoke of freedom, not abstract, but threatened, fragile, and under siege. He described a world divided, dictators advancing, democracies retreating, and time running short. This was no longer about Britain alone, it was about survival, about values, and about the future order. In London, Churchill read the transcript by lamplight, sensing a door opening wider, a lifeline being extended. Roosevelt named the 4 freedoms, simple words, powerful promises, meant to anchor public conscience. Behind them lay factories waiting, shipyards silent, and workers ready, if only given purpose. Opponents in Congress bristled, fearing war by degrees, entanglement by rhetoric, loss of neutrality. Roosevelt pressed on, voice steady, drawing a line between aid and surrender, between action and regret. He understood that tools required laws, votes, and courage, not just speeches. The nation was being asked to imagine sacrifice before bombs fell, before suns marched. As the session ended, lending arms became policy, not radical, but necessary. Across oceans, the machinery of war began to stir. Slowly, deliberately, and without turning back. On 11 March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act became law, quiet on paper, thunderous in consequence. Roosevelt signed it in Washington, pen steady, knowing neutrality had finally bent toward commitment. The act transformed Churchill's plea into authority, turning words into ships, planes, and steel. In Britain, the news spread quickly, across bombed streets and factory floors, lifting weary spirits. Churchill understood this moment deeply, because tools were now promised, not debated. America would become the arsenal, not yet the soldier, but already indispensable. Roosevelt framed the decision carefully: aid without boots, support without declarations, but history rarely honors such distinctions. Factories roared to life on 12 March 1941. Contracts signed, assembly lines humming with purpose. Steel moved inland, ships slid into rivers, and time itself seemed to accelerate. Across the Atlantic, convoys formed slowly. Vulnerable and precious, carrying more than cargo, they carried hope. German submarines watched patiently, aware that these tools could change the course of the war. Churchill wrote again, grateful yet urgent, because survival still hung by weeks and weather. Roosevelt read updates nightly, maps spread wide, losses marked in pencil. Each shipment narrowed America's choices, binding fate to Britain's endurance. The public sensed change, subtle but undeniable, as headlines shifted from debate to production. There was no turning back now, only forward motion, driven by necessity and conviction. The tools were moving, the world was watching, and the line between aid and war was thinning. On 27 May 1941, Roosevelt reviewed Atlantic reports. Concern etched across his face. Convoys were sailing, U-boats were hunting, and the ocean had become a battlefield without declarations. American sailors escorted British cargo. Orders cautious, yet danger constant and unforgiving. Churchill followed each movement closely, knowing tools lost at sea were hope sunk forever. Roosevelt authorized expanded patrols, defensive in language, provocative in reality, pushing the boundary. In Berlin, these moves were noted carefully, interpreted as intent, not accident. The president faced pressure at home, mothers fearing telegrams, isolationists warning of drift. Still, Roosevelt pressed forward, believing delay invited disaster, not safety. On 4 July 1941, he addressed the nation again, framing support as self-defense. He spoke of oceans as front lines, factories as fortresses, workers as guardians. Behind the rhetoric lay statistics: tonnage sunk, routes threatened, lives already lost. Churchill sensed American patience thinning, resolve hardening with every incident at sea. German commanders tested limits. Torpedoes striking near American hulls, messages sent in steel. Roosevelt read after-action reports late into the night, silence thick around him. Each clash shortened the distance between policy and war, between intention and inevitability. The tools were now defended by American lives, an unspoken truth shaping the future. By summer's end, the question was no longer if America would fight, but when. On 7 September 1941, Roosevelt approved shoot-on-sight orders, a quiet escalation with vast meaning. The Atlantic was no longer neutral water. It was contested space, dangerous and unforgiving. American destroyers hunted submarines, tension crackling across radar screens and ship bridges. Churchill welcomed the shift cautiously, aware that every step forward carried risk. Roosevelt framed the order as defense. Yet new history would judge it differently. German commanders reacted with restraint, for now, calculating timing and advantage. At home, isolationist voices weakened, drowned by headlines and near misses. The president watched public opinion harden. Slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. On 26 October 1941, The USS Reuben James was torpedoed, sailors lost to the sea. Roosevelt addressed the nation again, grief controlled. Anger restrained, resolve sharpened. Churchill sent condolences, understanding that blood changed everything. Factories worked through nights, production rising. Urgency embedded in every shift. The tools Churchill requested were now backed by American steel and sacrifice. Roosevelt sensed the narrowing corridor of choice, options collapsing inward. War hovered just beyond words, no longer theoretical, no longer distant. The decision Roosevelt had delayed was now being made by events themselves. On 7 December 1941, news shattered the quiet of Washington. Carried by urgent voices and disbelief, Roosevelt was at his desk when the reports arrived. Fragmented, alarming, impossible to ignore. Pearl Harbor burned, ships listed. Sailors fought smoke and fire. While history turned violently. Churchill heard the news in London that night. Emotion flooding through exhaustion and relief. He later admitted sleeping the sleep of the saved. Because America was now bound to the fight. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day. Words deliberate, fury restrained. Purpose absolute. The tools were no longer enough, now men would follow. Germany declared war days later. On 11 December 1941, confirming what many had expected. The Atlantic struggle widened into global conflict, lines drawn without ambiguity. Churchill crossed the ocean soon after, meeting Roosevelt face to face at last. They spoke late into the night, maps spread, cigars burning, futures debated. What began as a letter had become alliance, strategy, and shared destiny. Roosevelt reflected privately on that winter. Day a year earlier, the letter still vivid. The choice to act early had bought time, steel, and survival. Now the war would be fought openly, brutally, and together. The tools had done their work, holding the line until armies could march. History moved forward. Carried by decisions made before the first shots were fired. On 14 August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met off Newfoundland. Aboard warships rocking gently in the Atlantic. The wind cut cold, yet the mood was resolute, shaped by urgency and trust. Months before Pearl Harbor, they spoke openly. Charting principles rather than battles. The Atlantic Charter. Emerged there, ideals written. Against waves and uncertainty. Freedom of the seas, self-determination, and collective security were pledged quietly. Churchill saw in Roosevelt a partner, cautious yet committed. Shaped by responsibility. Roosevelt saw in Churchill endurance, forged by fire and unyielding resolve. Though America was not yet at war, alignment was unmistakable. These talks drew directly from that original plea, the tools evolving into vision. Sailors watched history unfold, unaware of how deeply it would define them. Later critics would question intent, yet context revealed inevitability. The charter set moral stakes, framing the war beyond territory or revenge. Churchill later called it a message to enslaved peoples everywhere. Roosevelt believed words mattered, especially before blood sealed them. The letter had opened dialogue. Dialogue shaped doctrine, doctrine would shape peace. The war's end was not yet visible, but its meaning was being written. On 6 June 1944, Roosevelt followed reports from Normandy, maps spread across his desk. The tools once promised now thundered across beaches, steel, and men moving together. Landing craft hit sand, shells burst, and decisions made years earlier came ashore. Churchill watched anxiously from London, aware of the gamble unfolding. The arsenal Roosevelt envisioned had matured into overwhelming force. Factories once silent now echoed in memory, replaced by fields of fire. Roosevelt reflected on that first letter, fragile yet defiant, a hinge of fate. What if he had delayed, hesitated, or bowed to fear? The question haunted him quietly, as casualty numbers rose. On 6 June 1944, the price of early choices was paid in blood. Yet without those choices, this day might never have come. Allied momentum surged, liberation followed, and the end began to appear. Churchill spoke of destiny fulfilled, though tempered by loss. Roosevelt grew visibly tired, burdened by years of war. The tools had become instruments of victory, but peace remained distant. Europe burned less brightly now, yet scars ran deep. History turned toward conclusion, shaped by decisions made in silence. On 12 April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died quietly, far from the roar of factories. The war he helped shape continued, carried by momentum, sacrifice, and shared purpose. Churchill received the news with shock. Grief heavy, gratitude unspoken but profound. He remembered the letter, written in desperation, answered with courage and foresight. The tools had crossed oceans, broken sieges, and altered destiny. On 8 May 1945, Europe celebrated victory, streets filled with relief and tears. Britain survived, battered yet standing, because help arrived before collapse. America emerged transformed, no longer distant, no longer hesitant. The partnership forged by words had reshaped the world order. Roosevelt never saw final peace, yet his decisions echoed everywhere. Churchill later reflected that timing mattered as much as bravery. Aid given early saved lives later, shortening darkness and despair. The letter was preserved, studied, and remembered as a turning point. It showed how leadership could act before certainty arrived. On that winter night in Washington, Roosevelt chose engagement over retreat. The world that followed was imperfect, scarred, yet free enough to rebuild. And it all began with a simple request: give us the tools.